Well, hello everybody, and thank you for coming. And I want to thank all the people that allowed me to be here. I am very excited to be able to speak with Ellen Gallagher. Rarely have I met a mind like this, and I saw the show this afternoon. And please go if you haven't. I feel I went in and I came out changed in ways I don't even quite know at this moment. So please go and see that. Elle and I have, we've been communicating for the last, about 5 weeks, about 5 weeks back and forth, and there's certain conversations that we didn't really get to finish and we've just touched on. So we are going to pick up on those conversations. And we thought I would like to ask you, Ellen, if you could first talk about this, your series, and this one, Ice and Salt, to just give some folks who may not be as familiar with your work a little bit about where it's come from and how it's developed till we get up to the more recent work.
Okay. So this work is from a series, Preserve, where I, started really I started working directly on these magazine pages. And the magazines are, it's an archive that I collect that is from about 1945 to 1975, my interest. And it's basically mid-century African-American magazines, Ebony, Our World, Sepia, some no longer in print. And I was initially attracted to why I chose just this one singular image. It's actually it's a series of about, I think it's 16 works on paper, directly working on the magazine page. I was attracted to the sort of ad hoc quality of the grid, and these mostly in these wig advertisements. But as I started moving through them, and since it's an archive, it's not like you're getting one once a month and reading it. It had a kind of speediness to it. I was passing through decades and, flipping through all these pages. I started to then, from this sort of interest in this gridded form, start to read the stories around the articles and the stories, the articles, and that it was a kind of mix of, it wasn't this sort of the way they appear now where they're more mainstream. It was this ad hoc jumble of, an interview with Haile Selassie and a Richard Wright text and a slasher text and, drag queen balls in Harlem. So all this, it seemed like it was almost like a kind of lost world, that, this idea that there had been this sort of radical, there seemed, even in they were sort of becoming assimilationist, but there seemed to be a link to something that was more urgent. And it's then started me thinking about, for instance, the way that the periodical has played a really important role in terms of forming ideas of representation in the diaspora, but in particular in America. And so, starting from 1900 with Pauline Hopkins, when she's the editor of The Colored American from 1900 to 1904, and because she really felt like, that post-Reconstruction, with the rise of lynching, that we could really slip back into slavery. And then this new scientific racist language, she actually started to use this language to write her serial stories that she published inside The Colored American, called Of One Blood, where she creates, using this sort of same kind of, this language of the time, she used it to actually do a double thing, to create a kind of Pan-Africanist weave, where the characters are revealed slowly to actually be African American. They've been passing, and they're both dead and alive. And so I started to think about that, and I started to think about also Hubert Harrison's, 1918, his, The Voice, and the Liberation League, and that he created the first idea of the New Negro in 1918, which was not assimilationist, that was actually in reaction to Du Bois and to the more assimilationist tendencies of Du Bois. So that even by the time I'm reading these magazines, in 1997 is when I started this work, reading these magazines from the 40s and the 70s, these stories are trickling out and around them.
Yeah. So you went from here, Ellen, and then into can we get some pictures of the watery ecstatic up here?
This is a detail.
If you could tell us also, Ellen, some of the details of how you made this physically, your relationship to it, of how you made it.
Yeah, so this one is from 2007. And it's a detail, but so you can see that it's actually it's watercolor and collage, but it's actually cut into the thick, heavy watercolor stock. So that's the way it's made. It's basically my version of scrimshaw. I'm using a scalpel for the first time here, really, as a drawing tool,
Okay.
and cutting into the stock, and as if these things are, again, surfacing from the paper. And in
Right.
some ways, they grow out of these earlier preserved drawings. They're actually surfacing from somehow within these fibers.
Okay. Could we see a couple more of those?
Yeah. So these are from 2001 into the present. It's a continuing series.
Okay, and so what I wanted to ask you about your new work, Arc, which I kept going back and I kept rotating around the gallery and coming back to this just, I think, extraordinary piece. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about this and talk about what we were talking earlier about ideas of projection and sort of collapsing and animating space, and what you said, a kind of vernacular projection. And along with that, how the work of Sun Ra and how that is influenced. We'll talk more about other pieces. So about what you were trying to do, and I would love to hear in detail the process of making Arc.
Okay.
Can we
So,
get that? Okay,
yeah. Oh, okay.
Well, we like seeing Ellen working there
Yeah.
too.
That's another. This is a print project that came out of. This is no longer original magazine pages, but faked. But we can maybe go back to that or not later. But yeah, let's get to Arc. I think that's at the very end.
Oh, I'm
you
seeing
have to
these,
go
and I
through.
just want to stay and hear
Oh, yeah.
more about all these. Yeah, I'm on here. The
But anyway,
Arc
Arc is made by. It's basically I started just intuitively. This is it. Gluing. It's actually not as flat as this appears here. It's actually several sheets of just magazine pages glued together. This is obviously a Cutty Sark ad, but it's actually quite thick. And gluing them together, they've been then sealed. And then I've taken a scalpel, and on one side is this really prominent ad, and on the other side, I've just sort of painted it over in a kind of heavy body gouache. And sort of there must have been some pink print matter underneath, so it's got this sort of uneven pink surface. And then I just started cutting these lozenge shapes into the sealed page, and kind of opening it up again. So the idea was that, you know, something that had been sealed was now going to be opened again. And the way I decided to open it was to cut these shapes and then take them out and flip them back in, sort of like flipping it back into itself. And what I found happened is that there was sort of an added presence or sentience by like this nonsense. You know, the kind of nonsense had a kind of, not a logic, but a kind of will to it. And so, you know, in the end, you know, this sort of, it's almost like it became a play on. I wasn't really thinking about the Cutty Sark ad, I think, but it became a play on inebriation, or like you were kind of this altered state, which is important in the work. But also, so you've got this sort of flip between the two sides, but also between the kind of graphic, you know, obviously emoji, black and yellow smiley face that is just the destruction, in a sense, of the Cutty Sark ad projects that out. So you've got like these different sort of skins of readability in this one surface that was interesting to me.
Okay, wonderful. Well, can you
I don't know if that's what you...
Yes, yes, but and I'd like to hear just about, you told me recently that the work of Sun Ra, the philosopher, poet, and composer, had very much influenced the new work.
Right, yeah.
And can you tell us how, or a little bit about how that triggered you?
Well,
or?
in this work, for instance, here, Sun Ra actually I came across these recently discovered typewritten notes, which relates more to Arc, that where he had actually been when he started his band, when the band starts performing in the 50s, he's actually already been rehearsing for several years in secret, and also had a private, a sort of secret research group, reading group, the My Research Group. And the idea was that these rehearsals, this music wasn't ready to be heard until it could change Earth. you know.
Okay.
And he actually he was also really interested in this call and response, this sort of rhetorics of religious rhetoric. And at the time, where in the 40s in Chicago, there was a lot of street corner stoop activity between like Black Baptist discourse and the Nation of Islam coming up, and he would actually pick fights with all of them just to he was sort of cantankerous, and he would come back, and he was a good reader of the Bible, but he had problems with it, and so he would have these sort of diatribes, these typewritten diatribes that would have these handwritten marks in the corner where he would make changes. So I found it really interesting that it was both a score, a typed score in a sense, that he was delivering, and also improvised. So he was creating a kind of a score and improvisation, like he would write notes as if he had to change, like what he would emphasize the next time he went out. And these things were actually kept really hidden and are actually really woven into the development of the more abstract music. So he's doing both at the same time. I think
Okay.
that's really interesting. And that this was sort of he actually believed that the arc, the orchestra was literally a 3D, that sound could be, he could create a 3D arc that would actually change Earth, and barring that, transport him and people who could engage the music off of Earth to
Yes.
Saturn.
Yes.
But I found that really interesting, that these notes are really, he's doing two things. It's like a kind of typology, a kind of, really fixed, a given, and then it's something that's also improvised. So he's already
Yes.
building his language, and that it's based on call and response. He's got to go out into the world and deliver these broadsheets and pamphlets. So again, this is really connected to the press at the time, which was also coming from oration and pamphlets and broadsheets, and
Right.
and that it spoke to a kind of a potentiality, like that wasn't really in real time, but was, could happen. And,
Well, I wanted to hear, there's this beautiful quote from Sun Ra where he says, "Your truths are self-evident, ours are a mystery." And I wondered if you could tell me your truths and ours. Well, who is the your and who is the ours, and does that at all?
yeah, for him, you mean? I don't.
Yes,
yeah.
him, or how you would read that.
I
From
mean,
him.
the way I read that,
Yeah.
I read that coming, I guess, being an American artist, sort of coming on the heels of post-minimalist form, and this idea of like self-evidence and the way that exists. So for me, I'm maybe misreading that, but I read that as, that the idea of self-evidence in a kind of Donald Judd, or that's so important, and that how to make this idea of the abstract I, that to have access to a kind of specificity and abstraction at the same time. And by mystery, I think what he's saying is that your givens might not be our givens,
Yes.
and that this idea of a given that we all take and can make self-evident, well,
Right.
it takes an act of will, an act of projection, if you will, into somebody else's space.
Yes.
So I think that's what. So the you and I think he's pretty fluid with that. That's about his
Yeah.
call and response. I don't think it's even.
Call and response,
I
yeah.
really think it's about this. You need to come back at me with something now. No, I think so. That
Yeah,
he's doing
yeah,
this, and
yeah.
so this idea of self-evidence, that it's not, that it is, and it's also about these sort of delays and apprehension and visibility, and that these things, like again, things that lie dormant and are unreadable, that then all of a sudden can become readable.
Yes.
And then that can create a kind of 3D plane.
Yes.
You know,
which
I think.
I see very much in your work.
Yeah.
I wanted to. One thing I'm interested in as a playwright is, and I saw these certain themes in Ellen, or at least I dreamed that I did, about on the stage. I very much like using ghosts, or those who come back from the past. And Ellen's been talking about, to be alive and dead at the same time, and the living and the dead, and sort of
That's something
collapsing
Sun
the
Ra, I
past.
think, is really also
Yes,
engaged in.
yes.
Yeah.
And so when I was been looking at Ellen's work and talking with her, I've been taken by a kind of hauntedness about the work, and about the past. That it's not just that the past comes through; it's more complicated than that. The past, can get flipped around. Like I'm fascinated by these the way things are cut, and other things inserted in them. And so connecting the ghosts, if I may, Ellen, as with wounds, because in my own work, I know that the idea of penetration for you is important, and I feel it is in my work. And I'd love to hear not only about a hauntedness, the living in the dead, and wounds in your work, but how the actual making of your work, the scratching, the scarifying, the almost wounding of your own work. How does that unfold?
Oh, I mean, One Flea Spare is in. Did I just say it wrong?
No.
No. Okay. Yeah. I'm thinking about that, where you have a character that has everybody has wounds that never heal. And they're on, and some of them are visible. There's a character that's completely covered up, and she's been burned all over her body, and so her wound is that she can't feel, because the burn she's been locked into a kind of numb space, right? And scarred, horribly scarred. And then there's another character that's been wounded in his stomach, and it continues to emit. It leaks, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they both have a kind of penetration of each other that is really healing and really erotic. I don't know, that is, where, he caresses her to find where she can feel, and she puts her finger into his wound. So I really respond to that, and because it's also, a way of showing a kind of penetration or erotic presence that is, it comes with so many other loaded traumas and it's also about carrying, a kind of carrier, like the body as the kind of carrier. So for me, the kind of inlay, or I often, the paintings get, here you can see I'm actually, what I do all the time is with a scalpel, that's me cutting into a printed thing that will then be layered, and so that idea that everything is inserted or cut, and I think it's about slowly accepting like what could be readable or not readable. I think that idea, I think that's something that exists more in literary form, that you can have a kind of presence in the book that like with Pauline Hopkins or even Samuel Delany, that's not revealed as African American until halfway through the book, and then you have to rethink, or Asimov, you have to Filipino, you have to rethink that shift of what you've been reading. So that kind of delay in representation is really interesting to me. So the kind of insert or ghosts, like with the bird paintings, for example, these are also ebony magazines. What you're looking at here is really identifiable. This is deluxe as ebony magazines, but in the recent work now that's in the gallery, I've actually taken these magazines and redacted them with black ink, leaving just the O's and E's. Here we have one, Racketeer. And so the black form is actually kind of abstracted drongo, racket-tailed drongo, that's actually been cut. It's made up of these same magazine pages, just the black void, and it's actually it's ebony or sepia magazine pages, random sort of these magazine pages that are, and I redact everything except the O's and E's, or maybe little bits of images, especially machines or something.
On the back of the bird, you got to get up close to these paintings.
But then the thing is actually constructed and inserted, not on top of the canvas, but through the canvas.
Right.
And then so it's actually inlaid in, and I guess my feeling is that somehow the time it's taken me from 1997 or 2001 working with these magazine pages into now, they're completely obliterated, but I think that they are still somehow present, in these portals, these O's and E's, these vowels that kind of come out, So I do think that even if it's not readable to the audience, it's somehow present there. That material is there, and that's now not only the ground, but it's also the figure, and it's the kind of the figure as absence, as a kind of body that can't be put together again.
Yes. Yeah.
But that took me a long time to answer your question. Sorry.
I like the long ones. Those are the most interesting.
Okay.
I wondered if we could we'll go back to this work, but if we could talk a little about the film, or you call it a wall text,
No, I didn't. I don't. Oh, that's funny.
Well, what would you call? I want to talk about Nothing Is.
Okay, This Is Nothing Is, which is a film I make with Edgar Klein. And Edgar and I have made several films
Okay.
together. We started off with Murmur, which is a single film made up of 5 16 millimeter projections, to Nothing Is, which is from 2013. And both films, happily, by happenstance, premiered at the Studio Museum in Harlem, so we really loved that. So it had a really
right.
active audience right away. But this is a film that is really not a film in a kind of 360 way. I mean, it is film, it's 16 millimeter film, but the way that Edgar and I work, we both do everything. But so we both are drawing, we're both, he's a bit more adept than I am with some things, but mostly we don't have really any boundaries in terms of the way we work.
Okay, that's what I wanted to ask you about, because collaboration, I love the idea of, and I think we're often not encouraged as artists to collaborate and let something out together. So
Yeah.
you're saying there's not a lot of boundaries there. It's
No.
not like Edgar does this part and you do this part.
Because he actually really, I mean, the way that I draw is not really with a lot of, it's very, it's a bit brutal, or it's not really like graceful. And he has a much more graceful hand, I discovered. So I like the sort of mix of it together. Anyway, but so what we've done here is kind of come up with this. For us, Nothing Is about, like, again, this idea of representation, how to make a picture that's, and so there's a text by Sun Ra, a poem, Nothing Is, that is actually scratched directly into film, into slide film. And then on either side of this text is bookended, is a kind of portrait of Samuel Delany. And both and it's sort of Samuel Delany in the sense of a science fiction writing that he does, and he does other writings, and I'm thinking especially of his work Nova from the 60s, and Sun Ra's poem from the 60s. So I'm thinking we sort of wanted to place them together because we felt like it was an exhibition about Afrofuturism, and we wanted to make a kind of portrait weaving them together, bringing these sort of, because they seem to be both dealing with transference and a kind of collapsing geographies, like shifting the way Samuel Delany will kind of project Harlem into a kind of his writings, a kind of speculative fiction, and the way Sun Ra will deal with just the ephemera of matter and like kind of create through a very kind of precise observations. That's a kind of supernatural, a supernatural that comes from just like a kind of natural history in a sense.
Right.
So this is actually it's a drawing on paper with plasticine and ink, and then we've gone in and we've made a film. We filmed it, and we've moved it a bit by hand, but then we've actually digitized it. We've run it through the computer. So when you stand there, it looks like it's still, but the more time you spend looking, you see that there are these movements that are happening that could only happen in a kind of 3D programming that then gets projected back out into film. So it's this kind of, again, 2D, 3D space that for me, is also, I hope, activated in the paintings, in terms of, or the prints or the drawings, in terms of like the elasticity of, by putting together these two different characters, people, or in the same way that I free associate, by putting together different associations, if the viewer will bear with me or put it together, you can get a kind of elasticity. And so the actual picture only exists in the elasticity of the engagement with it, in motion. So that's more obvious in a film like Nothing Is,
Right.
because it is moving for you.
Yes.
But the idea is that might happen in the painting or the drawing in the way it could happen in a novel, for
Yes.
example.
Well, and tell me about the
play.
film itself is threaded through a handmade harp. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little bit how that works and how you came to that?
Well,
You have to see it.
Yeah.
Watch the film and
yeah.
the violin.
So there
and hear
are
it.
this idea again about Sun Ra being interested in that he was creating a kind of 3D soundscape, that could actually be structural and move Earth, change Earth, move bodies. we wanted to play with that idea in terms of animated sound. So you've got this harp that is attached to the projector, to the looper, and the film at a certain point runs through the harp and plays itself. And that's also a play on this idea of self-evidence that we were talking about, like that the thing plays itself, it is itself. And that's a kind of sound that is, it's not an optical sound, it's a real-time sound. And because we wanted to do something, a lot of times when artists reference Sun Ra, I mean, because he's so much about spectacle, that, you know, it's all about the gold and the costumes, and, you know, and obviously you can see, you know, that like P-Funk comes out of that, and so much has come out of that, but it's also, we wanted to have some sound in the exhibition that could somehow, and so we tuned it as sort of a pun into the key of Ra, and but the thing is, it's real-time sound, you know, and at the same time, there's another sound in the film that's optical. It's on the optical print. So you've got these two different soundscapes happening in the film. You've got the optical sound of the film, and then you've got the real-time sound of the film itself mimicking a guitar pick, you know, playing itself.
Yes.
And running through. And so these things happen sort of together, but also slip apart.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. So.
Yeah. I wondered if we could pull up Dr. Blowfin's Black Storm.
Okay.
Can we get that? And what I wanted to ask you about this, Ellen, is I went around and looked at the work over and over, and then little by little I started getting closer. And that's when you can see the letters or some of the text. And I noticed with this one there was a little more of a text, and some of the text I saw was Simply Splendid, Learn from Negroes, The White Problem in America, Land, Politics. I love those words. But you have to do the work to find them in there. They're not obvious. I mean, none of it's obvious. And so here I saw more text that was decipherable. But in a lot of the other, in the other work there's more fragments of words. And I like to think of fugitive vowels and just pieces of words in the other. But this was the one where I could see a little bit more the text. So I wondered about those ones that I could read. How much went into finding those and picking those specifically, or do you sometimes just take the text where it falls? Or
it's both, but and a lot of it is also the way it's been, like, you can't really see it here, but the things have been stained and toned in these different sort of blacks or sepias, not browns, olive dusky kind of greens and pinks. And so some of it is that, it's kind of about tone and moving, you know, through it. But I also, there's a lot of happenstance in the work. So, for instance, I'll work on the sheets off of maybe which comes from printmaking, I'll work on the sheets you see that are, you know, inlaid into, you know, against each other in the form. I work them separately off the painting, staining them. And much like you would do on a printing press, where you work off the plate and then you build, you know, so it's not like it's not immediate. It's got this kind of building, constructing that happens. So I'm always conscious, I'm always reading the pages, is what I mean to say, as I'm working. But I don't ever know necessarily where they're going to end up.
Right.
Because then other considerations come in, like I need this big piece. But the readability here, because this was actually something that occurred in another work that was this big, and I thought I would like to blow that up. Something that I sort of found in another work and saw it looked like some kind of water spirit, and I decided what would happen if I would make that larger, and so again the text becomes more readable, and you've got this sort of sliding between being able to read the text and also read the image of the thing itself, so you can really more lucidly go back and forth between that. You know, reading the text on the piece of paper that makes up the larger form, you know.
Yeah. Well, and of course, because I work with text, that fascinates me. But I also love the in and out of what you see and don't see, depending on your proximity to it.
Right. So there's not a complete image then. You know, it's never like which is something, you know, I think we really discovered working directly into the film. That you can't, you know, it's always frame by frame by frame, even if it's real. It's projected through real film in the end. That's always important to us, no matter what we do. But that there is no fixed image. It just
Yes.
depends on perspective. It always, that's what makes the
It's always
picture.
shifting, yes. Okay, and there's so many things I have wanted to ask, Ellen. It's getting more and more, but I wanted to ask a little bit about the idea of ports and portals. Kind of anchoring that with Rotterdam,
Yeah.
where you live now, although you grew up in the earlier part of your life in Providence, Rhode Island, also a port city. So you said something to me that I wrote down. You said, "I am a stranger and right at home at the same time." And so I wonder, what is your relationship with ports? How does that feed you? I know there's spaces of sort of transaction, cargo, people, ideas, but also a sort of transmutation and a space of continual production. So I would love to hear about that and about
Okay.
ports.
Well, yeah, so I grew up in Providence. This is a map behind us. And your play, The Liquid Plain, takes place in Bristol, which you can see is also in Rhode Island, very
Yeah.
close to Providence in this detail. Providence and Plantations is the full name of Providence, Rhode Island. And, I grew up when in the 70s there, mostly in the 60s, and where I-95 cuts right through, and that happened a lot to see sort of working class communities along the New England, where communities got really split
Yes.
up. And so we are actually where my mom bought our house is kind of on a border neighborhood, kind of upstanding working class, but we're on the edge. We're literally on the port, but you don't think of it as a port, because it's not really active in that way anymore.
Yes.
There are all these hurricane barriers, and but I sort of grew up in this sort of by the sea, but not what you would think a sea would, not sort of this beautiful sea. I mean, it's a jewelry industry there. There's a lot of like jewelry factories, so there's all these shards of like magical, just debris from like the
Okay.
jewelry industry. So it was like a really great place to dig around scrap yards. So everything's sort of glinting. There are these scrap yards where everything's glinting, but then you're on the water, and it's still also pretty. It's kind of a tough area, and it's just it's a really mixed place. I mean, it's, for instance, very different than Boston, which is just 1 hour north. Providence is Cape Verdean, is Azores Portuguese also, and Irish and Italian. So it's just this mix of people,
Yeah.
working class people, pretty much, and so very not like Newport, which is just
Yes.
and ending up in Rotterdam, it just that was again by chance. It wasn't a plan. It's just because of my personal life. But it's been a great place to work, and my studio is directly on the port, and I just think it's it's sometimes funny to me that I ended up it's not a very beautiful place. I love it, but it's a very tough city. And again, it's a strong Cape Verdean community and Moroccan community, Turkish community. I mean, it's a really mixed city, a really importantly mixed city, because of its own traumas. It was bombed during World War II,
Yes.
completely obliterated. So the city center is very different from London or Paris or Amsterdam, where you've got this étoile, and the city center is white, and then the suburbs are more working class, more mixed. And,
Right.
and so Rotterdam's the opposite of that. Rotterdam has been so it was so destroyed and built up really quickly during this sort of moment of Dutch crisis architecture, where things had to get done quickly, that you have like a lot of people of color, working people in the center of the city. And that remains today, and that's a real specific kind of European, I think, potential character. It has kept it. It's not a real. It's not a top-down projection. Rotterdam's always a real bottom-up projection. So there's a real, and there's something very Dutch. The Dutch have a real sense of vernacular flow there, and especially Rotterdam. Everybody and everybody who's in Rotterdam really feels like we were bombed. Like they really, it's like this happened to us, even if they weren't there, their family wasn't there. It's like a kind of, again, this like living wound that is actually still part of like what that place is, and part of the transaction there, and how things. There's a kind of like, just a kind of remaking of what a city can be, a European city can be.
Yeah.
So, it's an exciting place for me because of these sort of, you know, this kind of bottom-up projection. And so, for instance, we finally have, and we're always digging up. There's always like, you know, I had a friend visiting me from Paris, and the roads were all dug up, and I said, well, you know, the Rotterdam, we have a lot of trauma because of the war, so we're always changing things, digging things up. And I said, you know, and he was like, God, it just looks like it was bombed yesterday. What happened, you know? But it's like, you weren't bombed yesterday, you know, so really like, oh, French uptight. But it is true, there is this constant, like, you know, we're all, you know, there's this sense of, but almost like you get the feeling that like anybody starts digging in the streets and building it up. I'm just like, is there a system to this? Is there, you know, and so we did finally get, you know, our we could go to the Rotterdam train station, which I'm really proud of. I don't know if it's like great architecture. I'm not like a giant architecture buff, but this is the central station. So it's new and it's really great. Like when you arrive in Rotterdam, you arrive here, and so what really happens, especially, well, the Dutch do this, but really Rotterdam people do this. Buildings get vernacular names. I don't know, I'm not really aware of doing that in the same way in New York. I know buildings are landmark named, but in Rotterdam, like people name things. Oh, that's, you know, and it's always some kind of cartoony joke, you know, vulgar name. So this, so they're looking for, you know, discussing what will be the name, and it's already called, this is called now Station Capsalon. And Capsalon, so this is it, and Capsalon, and I thought like, what, that's so weird. What is, you know, and I realized that there's this giant dish now that's really insanely popular in Rotterdam, and they think the station looks like the tin bakje, snack bakje, that would hold this food, this little tin. So there are all these sort of like, Rotterdam's all about like I mean, we have McDonald's and unfortunately Kentucky Fried Chicken, but because it's such mixed cultures, we have like this takeaway food.
Yes.
But it's not, it's kind of slow cooking. It'll be very culturally specific, sort of. So this is actually the story is there was a Cape Verdean hairdresser that would go to this shawarma place nearby, and would you know, so it's a shawarma restaurant, and would say what dish. He would kind of make his own sort of version of shawarma, and so it basically has mayonnaise and iceberg lettuce. I mean, it's pretty disgusting, but he would it's just a bossy hairdresser that would say, I want this, and that's my dish. And so then he started to send his intern in, you know, the assistant, and to describe what he wanted. He was like, you know, we're from the Capsalon. So this dish actually became a really popular dish. It's a huge, it's like throughout the Netherlands.
Which means hairdresser.
Belgium. It means hairdresser. Capsalon means barbershop. But it just means, but that's how they said, oh, what those guys want, that's what they want. So I found that really interesting that, you know, and Rotterdam has a lot of, you know, there's a lot of sharing of culture. Like it seemed to me about what you were talking about in your work, like in theater. There's a lot of theater in Rotterdam, like living cultural form, living theater, and that somebody else from another distinct culture could go in and in this sort of bossy way make, you know, his version of your food, and that then becomes the version. And you know, and I found this on Facebook. I think we can go. There was this, a Dutch reporter was in Syria, and there was a jihadist, and they said, what is it that you miss most about the Netherlands? So it's just about, like, you know, projections and being, you know,
When Ellen and I were communicating, and she told me about this Capsalon, which, you know, my mother's family actually came from Rotterdam, and then they moved to Amsterdam. But I had not heard of this Capsalon. And Ellen was talking about her notions of an open culture and relating it to this Capsalon dish, and I just thought, I got to meet this woman. This is just amazing. How much time do we have here? Are we doing okay? I just wanted to ask one more question, and then I think we could open it up. And the reason I'm going to read this question, and I'll tell you why. We have a brilliant historian and cultural critic, I would say the best in the United States, and his name is Robin Kelly. And Ellen and Robin have been communicating for some time, and he has written about Ellen's work. And he unfortunately wasn't able to be here, and I fortunately was. but he said, I want to give a question to Ellen. And he said to
Oh,
surprise her, something
Oh,
maybe you
no.
haven't talked about. And so I read the question and was terribly jealous that I hadn't thought of it myself. So I just thought I would read it to you, Ellen, and pick out whatever you want to respond to, and then we could open it up for questions. So in the spirit of Robin Kelly, this is the question. In case you all haven't read his phenomenal book called Freedom Dreams, please do. This is Robin's eye. I want to explore your relationship to water in greater depth, no pun intended. On the one hand, you are fascinated with the grid. On the other hand, your life and work have been surrounded by water. You talk about being the descendant of two islanders, having grown up in Rhode Island, working on an oceanographic research vessel, which she did as well, your fascination with sea life, Moby Dick, etc. On the one hand, what could be more resistant to the grid than bodies of water? And yet, outside of your formal artistic production, you've worked in fields that attempted to either classify and organize marine life forms or literally impose a kind of grid onto water. And Ellen had worked on creating a bridge that would float on water, and Robin says it collapsed.
It
But anyway,
exploded.
there was the
That
idea.
was long after. I didn't have anything to do with that. I had very low-level work on that.
And finally, at the end of this comes Robin's question. How have these experiences, working to classify oceanic life or build roads upon water, shaped your work and your understanding of and relationship to bodies of water?
Oh my God, see, he's so good. You don't need me for that. Well,
Water.
just the end of that. I think. So growing up on the water doesn't mean, it's not like I went sailing or anything. So the first time I was really, for a long time, on water. I mean, I didn't have access to that part of the water. I was in a community that was surrounded by water, but it was city. It wasn't like posh, we're off sailing on sailing. It wasn't like that. But when I did this sea semester program, I was surrounded by water all of a sudden, and it was really, and there was another point in my life where I was in Alaska, and that was what actually sparked me to want to go to sea semester. But anyway, seeing that water, my science project was pteropods. I was not a science major at all, and I don't want to pretend to be a biologist or anything, but my project was a miscommunication, basically. I thought I would be capturing these pteropods underwater. They looked so beautiful. I took too long to choose my project, and I ended up realizing too late that they were microscopic. So what looked like beautiful butterflies on this giant slideshow, I thought, oh, I'll do that. That looks easy. And they turned out that the things were microscopic, and they moved through these water columns at different times of day. So that meant that I was on a sailboat, and I had to do every 3 hours these Nevstan net tows, to find out where they were on the water column, and then pick them up and then look at them under a microscope and draw them and try to map where they were. But what I discovered doing that was that there were these different temperatures of water. So I discovered that, like, within what looked like at one point a single body, there was something which salinity maximum water, for example, which is like a separate sea that lives inside of the Caribbean Sea, and you can't predict where it would be. And so one of the predictors were some of these measurements I was doing when I was doing the net tows. So like my project actually wasn't a very great project, but was useful for someone else's project who was doing a much more important project about where's salinity maximum water, and when do you find it, which will be warmer because there's more salt in it, and it's actually literally different buoyancy in it. So and also seeing literally like the Gulf Stream, like seeing like strips of color through the water, getting that kind of vantage point so that you could actually see that. I mean, it's very disorienting to have this feeling that this thing you're on, and you can't see land, you've been out for a week altogether on this schooner, and to realize that the whole thing could fall apart at any minute, that it's so disparate. That it's actually, and there are like rivers and lakes and separate seas running through the thing, and that, you know, I don't know if that answers his question a bit, but I just...
Well, the sort of grid, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it was, so in a way it was by using the grid, in a sense, or this sort of a methodical approach to trying to apprehend something, to realize that surface was in fact quite disparate, and was made up of all these parts. Yes. And so in a sense that does, you know, address the dialectic, or kind of you know, the potential of the matrix within the grid, that the grid can actually can reach out into the world.
Right. And when you were talking about those little creatures, what were they?
Pteropods.
Yeah, and then we see these, what do you call them, Medusa jellyfish?
I call them jellyfish, but I mean, Aimé Césaire would call them a Medusa in his poem. It's more poetic, Medusas. Yeah. But I would say jellyfish.
Great. Well, we're going to open it up, but thank you, Ellen.
Thank you.
That was wonderful.
Robin.
Sorry, I had to do that. You did
Thank you.
that. So, do we have a microphone that we could maybe pass around for questions, or just projecting voice is great too?
Or you could say a question and we could read it, say it back, or I don't know. We'll hear it.
Yeah.
If you have a question.
Please.
Can I ask about your use of colour?
Yeah. What do you want to know about it?
Yesterday I went to the colour symposium. You were talking about colour in really interesting ways. And then after that I went to see your work. And then I had all that in my head. And all I kept looking at was the colour and the light blues. The colour. It was just like, I wonder what semiotics of colour means to you with these paintings, with these works.
I guess I'm not, like, that's not really, I mean, I could say this. I mean, semiotics of color is not really a language that I would use to talk about my work, do you know? I mean, consciously, I mean, that's not my approach. But of course, you know, I think it's for me about apprehension, and it's about two things. I mean, there's a kind of delay that's important in the work for me. And in some ways, having different tones right up against each other can kind of create a greater reading of something, and can also obliterate readings, and just can make things take longer. So, I mean, the color in my work is in some ways also very happenstance. I don't work from a chart. I don't work separately. I really work from the material itself. So the blue in the penmanship paper literally comes from the blue lines, even if I obliterate them. So it has a kind of language or logic to it, but it's very material based. So the choice of blue is literally because the lines that were originally there are blue, and then it's soaked in blue. That's one way of, and that it will always be this very translucent blue, because I always saw the lines as a kind of skeletal form on the page. So it has that kind of meaning for me. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
I think there was someone back here. Yes?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You talked about Sun Ra and transformation,
Yeah.
the physical possibility of something consciously impossible. Is your art making that same, trying to coalesce all those nebulous qualities and using, does art have that power for you?
Well, I think you said something consciously not possible in Sun Ra, so I think first I would disagree with your point, because I do think...
I just mean we're in the Royal Institute of Science.
No, but I mean, I think he's somebody who looks so precisely at, like, the natural world. So, I mean, for instance, that poem, Nothing Is, I think he's not really like, it's very matter of fact. That's what's so attractive to me about him. He's not It's not impossible. I mean, in fact, you know, water does become air, does become fire through friction. It's very logical. It's quite common sense. And so I think it's this, I'm really interested in this idea of like a kind of perception that can be kind of a kind of closer looking, which isn't just looking with your eyes, but a kind of, you know, openness or receptivity to serve, you know, to can create, I think, another plane, a potential. That it, maybe that's what you know. That's not maybe when you said conscious, but it's not that it's impossible, because it is possible. I mean, that's the thing that's interesting to me about him. I'm a pretty matter-of-fact New England person. I like that he's really, everything he's saying is quite, it's sort of like addressing the supernatural through the natural, you know, through a very matter-of-fact, commonsensical reading, you know, that, and I do hope, yeah, I mean, I certainly play back and forth in my work between a kind of 2D reading, or I'm given a kind of 2D reading, whether I like it or not, and, you know, hope for something else. And I you know, I do believe that you can, you know, I mean, I guess I do have
I suppose
hope.
what I was asking was, is art a specific function of creating the cosmic as physical and real?
I think so. I think so. For me, absolutely. I mean, you know, I think that art for me can change the past. I really believe that, like, if you create something, you can at least change our apprehension of the past. I don't really see art as cathartic. That's not really interesting to me, but I think that what we do in the future, what we can speculate now, can affect, you know, what we can see into the past, so therefore can change how we make what we think the past was.
Yes?
I don't have a good question.
Sonia, of course.
Question, which is, this is a question of humour. And given the seriousness,
Yeah.
I just wonder, yeah, I mean, it's not a complete question.
No, I think that has been a kind of problem in the work, but I mean, I hope a productive problem, and I think that's part of, like, yeah, I think, you know, because it is goofy in a sense, and because it can have this 2D reading, it can, you know, it can be like the wig ladies, the yellow plasticine wig ladies, when in fact I'm actually also making this weave, but it's not that that's not there as well. I mean, you know, it is, maybe it has to do with, you know, I have to keep myself, you know, engaged, and I do think the work does come out of play, essentially. You know, it really does come out of a kind, you know, it's not like you know, I have this all mapped out and then I go and start. I mean, sometimes, but I think it really comes out of the work itself. So if it's not playful or to me, then it would shut down. And so I have to also project for myself. I have to first make these associations and then try to convince you they're there. So I just will use all the arsenal I have to do that. And so the humor is part of that, but it's also part of really what I feel when I think about some of these things. It's not like separate for me, you know. I think that's also what attracted me to the you know, like peg leg baits. I mean, this is a really good example. Look. I mean, this is somebody who's lost his leg in a cotton gin, you know, and it was mangled, and because the White Hospital wouldn't take him, his leg was amputated on his family's kitchen table, and so that stump, that prosthetic stump, which, you know, he bounces off that thing. He's a projectile off of that thing. So I mean and he has a great sense of humor, and he's sort of like both a kind of vaudeville old, you know, humor, and he's also was a civil rights activist. He kind of bridges a kind of potential for humor, I think, both public and private. And I think in the magazines, I also found that when I talk about these dominant and dormant threads, there's this kind of really, at the same time, it's kind of assimilationist. You've got this really, you know, made for kisses, lighter. I mean, this kind of skin bleacher that will have this really kind of nasty humor that's like, well, this is what we got to do. Or, it's very scabrous, and I find that really interesting I think in that humor, you have a kind of dormant thread to a kind of radical urgency,
Yes. Yes, back there?
I'm going to the scrapyards in Rhode Island. I'm kind of curious about technique and about whether finding objects there or even the industry itself that somehow very early on inspired you.
That's interesting because of the inlay and
If you look at some of the grids, for example, one which I think is called
Excellento.
where you go through incredible permutations of treatment and things like that. So is there anything?
That's a very interesting question, and there must be. I didn't ever work in a jewelry factory, but I know what you mean. I mean, and you do get these bits, and that these bits could then be worked together again. For example, here, this is Isaac Hayes. So this was, again, with keeping with Sun Ra, Black Moses, remember? And this was actually this is what he wore to collect his Oscars, which I love. That's what he walked down the red carpet wearing, and no shirt. And I've tattooed his shoulders and put gray plasticine in his eyes. But I've cut out all the picture of the necklace, and I've actually literally inlaid it into him with Swarovski crystals. But I mean, so that there is certainly something jewel-like to my practice, and that could be, that's what was around me aesthetically, this sort of costume stuff, but also just metal bits that, thank you, that's something I would like to think about more, but I don't have a really lucid question for you, answer, but it's an interesting question. Thank you.
I'm quite interested now. You've spoken a few times about the 2D kind of struggle of boundary, whether you work with it. What kind of freedom do you feel that the film work has taken you into, and even the soundscape that you're using in your recent works?
Well, the film, this work is deluxe, which was a grid of 60 printed. I learned how to do printmaking in a way. I mean, I started printmaking when I was 16, but it wasn't until I made the films with Edgar, scratching directly into the film, the monster, where the yellow wigs are scratched directly into the films, that I realized, that the film was a plate, that was one plate, and that I could make all these changes, and then I could print it and layer it, and I could make something else. So it was actually by making the film that I actually learned how. So this was made in 2003 and 2004, and very quickly then I moved to making deluxe. So they are absolutely related. I guess because the film was so obviously an object that I had to figure out, and I only use it as an object because I'm not a filmmaker. This is found material. It came from outer space, 1953 B movie. And it was, and it's about, this alien comes from outer space, and it's a Cold War, horror movie where the alien is changing everybody. But I decided that I would kind of graffiti into it, scratching directly into the film, releasing this film stock, so that yellow is not painted on. It's actually what was already there, ever there. And I liked that idea that, in a sense, we hijacked this narrative by cutting into it and releasing what was always already living, also in terms of delayed readings. Now that was just a B movie, but now we read that, we think, okay, 1953, that's the Cold War. So we know what that is about, So.
I think
Well, it's an observation, really. I was in New Orleans in the 70s, and what struck me was that there was an awful lot of, quite a high majority of Negro ladies would wear yellow wigs. And I was completely thrown by this because I'd never seen this. And I couldn't quite understand, because obviously at that particular time there were still certain sorts of issues. And when I first saw your work, it surprised me that prior to seeing your work, I would comment on this to various people, and they'd never heard or seen this kind of particular thing. And it was the first time that I'd seen a comment on it, and I wanted to know, was this a particular specific comment you were making on this practice, or was this chance? Because also I came across, I was particularly interested in Sun Ra, and you were the first person that actually had brought these two things together.
You're talking about in the 70s, African American women wearing blonde wigs?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, it's certainly by 1970 wouldn't have been about, it's no longer about assimilation, right? So, I mean, and it's no longer about whiteness. That's what I find interesting. So it's sort of like, you know, often that's again about projection. Ideas, you know, white people will see something and assume it's about them, you know, and it's not, you know, because Etta James already happened. So it's like too late in history to go back, you know, like Etta James already was rocking a blonde, you know, so it's not, and so, yeah, I mean, so that is also about projection, and that's sort of what I was talking about with Capsalon in terms of, I don't know if I'm being clear, but like a projection from something or a projection onto something.
No, it's just unusual that I had never really come across this kind of imagery other than having seen this so
Well, New Orleans is a wildly beautiful place, and people have a lot of style. It sounds like a gorgeous, you know, yeah.
Are we okay for a couple more? That's great. Yes?
Well, first, only because that was just said, I thought it was quite interesting you answering that question, just because when I first saw them, I always just thought about blonde ambition as a thing that anyone might have. Rather than.
Well, yeah.
I was thinking about the idea of defacing magazines and all of the main places you seem to focus on, the eyes and maybe the hair, and then drawing additional things, maybe attacking each other. They feel like things that you might do automatically, maybe especially when you're younger, or like absent-mindedly just like giving people horns or something, and especially scratching out the eyes. Was that kind of?
So you're kind of talking about, like, in a sense, like a more, like a doodle in a way.
Almost, yeah. To the doodle, but then the people always seem to do the same thing, whether it be on a billboard outside or a magazine at home, kind of scratching out the eyes. And I don't know.
Well, for me, it's not really so here's a good example. It's not really a scratching out of the eye. I mean, it's really that the eyes are cut, you know, so I mean, I certainly don't deny the brutality of it, but they are then inlaid with a plasticine skin, flat skin. And for me, it's about possession. You know, it's not so much about defacing as it is about plugging. She's been conscripted from, you know, she's from 1950, you know, and what I love looking at this is, you know, no matter what I've done to like shift her presence, you really know there's something about her where you know she's not from 1980. And why do you know that? Like, I mean, I think that what is it that no matter what we, you know, do that is sort of somehow resonating through? What sentience is in that, no matter what I do, that is still itself? That's something that's really interesting for me. So what I try to do is to possess characters, but I like that they resist me, that they have this drag, you know, that they don't come willingly. They've been conscripted, and that you feel that she is both. That's what I mean by dead and alive. She's both like dead and alive. She's been made new, so she's got this, you know, and her wig is this sort of like that from, what is that cartoon? Anyway, she's hypnosis, you know, she's hypnotizing you. It's clearly a hypnotic wig, you know, there's some, anyway, so. But I also like that she's everyday people, you know, it's not like some glamorous wig model. It's just a very matter-of-fact looking face.
You know, I like what you say about she's scripted, but she's resisting, because I feel this kind of vibrant agency has come into this, what Ellen's created. And the eyes, again, like portals, so to speak, but there's something, it like looks back, but at the same time we want to capture someone's eyes, and you cannot do this. And there's a power to that she has now. I really feel that it's an empowering, and yes, there's the humor, a kind of humor, a very robust humor, I'd say, but of course that also has a real agency, a real resistance, as we know humor can, specifically laughing at power or laughing at our attempt to claim someone and project who they are. Could we maybe have one more question? If there is it. Yes.
I went to a talk yesterday about education and teaching at the Light Chapter. One of the
Could you speak a little louder, please?
One of the publications that they sort of brought light from the 70s was birthing a lot of concrete poetry in it. Like, how do you see yourself relating to kind of the construction of concrete poetry, and then you also mentioned cartoon. Like, are there things changing around those subjects for you?
That's really interesting. One of my earliest, when I went to art school, I was in Boston, and so the kind of looming figure there is Philip Gustin. So he's somebody who's really important to me. And actually, like, a lot of the kind of hypertext or kind of concrete poetry comes out of, like, Brown, Robert Coover, and in particular, I was really moved by, now I'm going to mash up his name. Is it Calvin Coolidge or Clark Coolidge? There's a, what, Clark? Clark, thank you. Clark Coolidge and Philip Gustin made a book together where Philip Gustin did drawings based on the concrete poetry of, and so it's just really, that is something that I think about. And funny that this is up here. Can you go to the full image of Wiglet? Of the work Wiglet from, it's the one right after this. So this is actually, so what you'd seen earlier was, the previous one is actually from the Excellento, from one of the three large-scale yellow paintings that are 16 feet long and made up of 396 pages that are then, but here, if you go back to Wiglet, which we were just at, this one. This is actually, now I've taken, this is a page, a real magazine-sized page, but it's all been mangled up, and you can't get in closer, I guess, to see, but the text is all this run-on sentences, and this is the closest thing to a kind of, like, real poem in the piece. And it's made, again, I've cut and pasted, so it's a wig ad, and I've cut and pasted all these texts that were random around it together, and then I've made a plate and printed them along. So there are all these, like, sometimes random, sometimes created, like happenstance sentences, like run-on sentences that don't make sense, with these then these characters. And the other thing I love about the plate process, I just want to say, is it's an aquatant, so it's a continual tone. So it's not like often when we reproduce something, there's a kind of degeneration. A reproduction loses something. But with the aquatant, because the original magazine, was never an original, it's a print. It was a cheap lithographic print. The actual deluxe, the strange thing about that is quite creepy, is they have more life in their skin tone than the original. Because it's a continual tone, it's almost like they've been soufflated with light. Like there's much more light in their flesh. So they are much more present than in the original magazine page. But
Well, thank you all very much for coming out, and Ellen, thank you for your fantastic work. May you continue.